The Battle of Hürtgen Forest, known in Germany as Schlacht in Hürtgenwald, is the most extended single battle the U.S. Army has ever fought. It was composed of a series of ambushes, skirmishes, and offensives in the Hürtgen Forest on the Belgian-German border between September 19th and December 16th of 1944. The U.S.'s goal was to keep the Germans busy from reinforcing the units fighting in the Battle of Aachen. Additionally, American troops were tasked with capturing Schmidt and Monschau, paving the way for venturing into the heartland. American author Ernest Hemingway, a reporter for a magazine at the time and friend of Colonel Lanham, an American officer who took part in the clash, described the battle as Passchendaele with tree bursts. As a World War I veteran himself, he recalled the grim encounter of 1917, in which British and Canadian forces suffered more than 300,000 casualties in gaining a little more than a 5-mile salient. In Hürtgen Forest, the Americans suffered nearly the same fate. Surrounded by overgrown darkness and attacked by the cold weather, they paid with blood every inch of ground they took from the last German defenders of the Reich. Many Allied soldiers believed the battle was useless because it had no clear strategic purpose from the very beginning. It was a failure that cost more than 30,000 unnecessary lives in the U.S. The admirable German resistance shown during the fierce encounters was a prelude of what was to come with every future battle the Americans would face as they approached Berlin. American GIs referred to the 3 months of continuous combat as the Green Hell that almost broke U.S. troops' morale on the Western Front. World War II nears an end. After the successful landings in Normandy and southern France in the summer of 1944, the Allied advance began to slow down as they ventured further west towards the heart of Germany. For every inch the American forces took, German resistance increased significantly, to the point that everyday movements became even slower and almost imperceptible to those on the ground. German citizens, caught in the struggle of surrendering to the Russians or the Americans, or fighting to the last man, suffered from the daily Allied bombardments of American B-17 flying fortresses. In September of 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower recapped his plan for winning the war. One day he cabled American officers, quote, "The enemy has continued to reinforce his forces in the west. Present indications are that he intends to make the strongest possible stand on the west wall, in the hope of preventing the war spreading to German soil." The west wall was the Siegfried Line, a heavily fortified German position at the border with France and Belgium. Eisenhower devised that the final battle before the liberation of Europe would unfold in 3 phases that he classified in a series of battles. Those would be the approach to the Rhine River, the seizure of bridgeheads over the river, and one last advance that would lead straight into the heart of Deutschland. He established that 7 Allied armies would cross the Rhine from north to south, including the U.S. 9th, 1st, 3rd, and 7th, with the support of French 1st, Canadian 1st, and British 2nd armies. The crucial objective was to neutralize the German war machine by subduing the industrial centers in the Ruhr and Saar regions in the north and center of the Reich's territories. Once that was clear, Berlin was the ultimate target. In early October 1944, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division arrived at Aachen to support the 19th and 7th Corps encircling the city's German garrison. On October 22nd, after a ferocious but futile resistance, German commander Oberst Gerhard Wilk surrendered and gave way to the Allied forces. The Allied command concluded that it was necessary to capture the Ruhr Dam to prevent the Germans from flooding the surrounding areas where U.S. units would be operating. American commanders Collins, Bradley, and Hodges agreed that the quickest and best route to the dam was straight through the Hürtgen Forest. Historian Russell F. Vigley would later write, quote, "The most likely way to make the Hürtgen a menace to the American army was to send American troops attacking into its depths." And that was precisely what was about to happen. A hostile environment. Since August 1944, shortly after the southern invasion of France concluded, the Allied supply line had worsened, which often resulted in shortages of food, ammunition, and winter clothing for the troops that would fight during the last months of the year. Logistic problems slowed military operations until they could keep up with the supplies that Allied units required at the front. Added to that, the U.S. soldiers quickly discovered that they were not just fighting against the tenacious German defenders and their fighting spirit, but the environment itself of the Teutonic wilds. In the early winter of 1944, when the U.S. began operations near Germany, the weather was cloudy, wet, and cold, with rain and snow. At Hürtgen Forest, things were no better. In the outskirts of cities, The roads and villages in the forests were naturally protected by the terrain. Trees were numerous and densely packed, making air support unavailable due to the high canopy and the poor visibility provoked by the fog and gray skies. Some GIs said that they were deep ravines where even at midday, sunlight barely penetrated, leaving entire areas almost pitch dark. An unnamed U.S. officer wrote, quote, "I never saw a wood so thick with trees as the Hürtgen. It turned out to be the worst place of any." On the ground, armor and other vehicles could barely move through roads because of the thickened trees and conifers, rendering tanks almost useless for the offensive. The Allied military advantage in armor and manpower was significantly slowed and diminished because of the terrain. Small groups of defenders could hold out against a superior force without effort. 4 regions formed the Hürtgen Forest, 11 miles long and 5 miles wide in all. Infiltration and flanking tactics were simple maneuvers employed by both armies that often resulted in little terrain gains since the offensive began. Misinterpreting German topography proved to be a major error. Joe Collins, 7th Corps commanding officer, would later acknowledge the mistake, quote, "We had not studied that particular part of the zone. That was an intelligence failure, a real combat intelligence failure." To make matters worse, the German defenders fortified the forest with bunkers, pillboxes, machine gun nests, mines, tripwires, and barbed wire, making the U.S. advance particularly painful. The meat grinder. The American forces numbered approximately 120,000 able men, led by Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges. In comparison, the German troops were initially composed of barely 5,000 men, and 2,000 in reserve under General Lieutenant Hans Schmidt's command. Reinforcements would bring that total number closer to 80,000. More than half of the German units were integrated with underage boys and old men no longer fit for combat. 2 companies of Düren policemen were known by the German garrison as the family fathers, because their youngest were in their early 40s. The first phase of the offensive began on September 14, 1944, with the capture of Schevenhütte. American forces of the 47th Infantry Regiment tasted for the first time the German will to hold them off for as long as possible. On November 7th, the first phase ended with an unofficial ceasefire that a German regimental doctor, Hauptmann Gunther Stuttgen, negotiated with the U.S. forces. The Americans failed to retain control of the positions at Kahl Valley. It would not be until February 1945 when U.S. forces seized control of the Kahl Trail and Schmidt. Operation Queen was part of the second phase. The objective was to capture the northern section of the forest and move to the south of Düren. On November 16th, the 22nd Infantry Regiment soldiers began climbing a ridge toward the Rohr River Plain. The men were about to start 18 days of hell in what many of them would call the meat grinder. Ernest Hemingway, who at the time lived in a house near the village of Wicht when he worked for Collier's magazine, said that it would, quote, "save everybody a lot of trouble if they just shot them as soon as they get out of the trucks." The Double Deuce Regiment was one of many units that first landed in Normandy in June of 1944 and made it into Europe's heart. Commanded by Hemingway's friend, Colonel Charles Lanham, the unit was famous for its motto, "Deeds, not words." They fought since the beginning of Phase 1, but by November 20th, 1944, the unit suffered severe casualties. The regiment lost more than 50% of its men. It cost the regiment 3,000 casualties to advance a little more than 6,000 yards in 20 days. Collins of the 7th Corps said, quote, "We had to go into the forest to secure our right flank. Nobody was enthusiastic about fighting there, but what was the alternative? If we had turned loose of the Hürtgen and let the Germans roam there, they could have hit my flank." It's estimated that 1 or 2 U.S. infantrymen fell for every 2 yards gained. The casualty rate of the regiment was a stunning 80% of its strength of 3,250 men. Units from other divisions and regiments were mauled in the campaign. The German garrison was firmly dug in and was tough to beat. The aftermath. The initial offensive ended in failure. The Germans were victorious in the defense. When the campaign ended in December 1944, the U.S. suffered 33,000 casualties. German losses were almost the same. In February 1945, almost 6 months after the offensive began, the U.S. would finally capture the Hürtgen Forest. A memorial sculpture on Kahl Bridge today recalls the ceasefire of November 1944. It was created by Michael Pullman, who said that the offensive was, quote, A controversial battle with no true strategic purpose that ended up making it to the history books like the US Army's longest battle ever fought yet.